join Nation Underdog. I'm Mark Harvey. Today we're going to talk about this idea of globalization, this notion that through free trade, through opening borders as much as possible, business people can access markets to a degree never before heard of, and countries can grow richer and richer. And so we'll talk about the positive side of globalization in this video as well.
Wow. Meanwhile, back to the ranch.
They have to take care of themselves.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about globalization. Globalization is the logical extension of everything really we've been talking about so far. It's that, you know, the more you expand trade, the more you create relationships, create all sorts of transactions between different countries, the more the world becomes globalized. And many have argued that this process of globalization has really expanded like crazy since the birth of the Bretton Woods system. So what I would define globalization as, and there's different definitions, I think your book defines it a little bit differently, but this is sort of an easier way, I think, of considering it, is that globalization is the international integration of politics, economics, and culture.
What I want to talk to you today about is political integration, right? It's part of globalization. Now, one is the EU. Thanks, Courtney. Hey, could you put that coin up for a second? I wish I had a bill, but I spent it last time I was in Europe. Look, see, that's a €2 coin. Look, they have not only become more politically integrated, but they actually have the same currency. Another example, NATO. There have been more and more countries getting involved in NATO, and again, it's another symbol of globalization. Another is the increased power of the United Nations. Now, you can think that the United Nations is sort of full of crap and not very strong and all this, but you know that it's pretty powerful when you've got George W. Bush, who doesn't really want to go to the UN to get permission from them in order to invade Iraq. And he actually feels like he's got to go, and even if they say no, he still has to ask. That's a pretty strong institutional constraint. And again, another big sign of global integration politically. What this means in a practical sense is that nation states aren't nearly as powerful as they once were, certainly politically. We're going to talk about economic integration a little bit more. To bring this topic up, I think we need to introduce a couple of our friends. First, a very, very sexy guy in the eyes of many women throughout the world. Ooh, do you know who that is, Courtney?
Is that David Beckham?
That's David Beckham. And you know what's funny?
That he's so hot?
No, actually that's not what's funny. That's what's sexy. No, what's funny about it is he's actually like the most famous athlete almost in the entire world. There's only one guy I can think of who's more famous than David Beckham.
Who's that?
It's this guy. And you know who that is?
Michael Jordan.
The world knows who Michael Jordan is. And you might wonder to yourself, you might say, hey, self, why is it that I'm bringing up some of my athletic friends here if I'm talking about economic integration? You can't just think about economic integration just in terms of like, coal and steel and widgets that you ship across borders and stuff like that. It involves a lot of other things, and entertainment is one of the #1 major exports from the United States. Obviously, economic integration is a lot larger than just sort of this idea of sports and stuff. Right, Courtney? Obviously, we see examples in the World Trade Organization, in NAFTA. There's lots of examples of this going on throughout the world. What are the implications? Well, for one thing, there's a lot more cooperation going on between the major powers in terms of economics. What this means in practice is that, relatively speaking, a lot of non-state actors have gained relative power, like multinational corporations, for example, and that there's a greater degree of cooperation.
And is worth talking about in terms of this discussion of neoliberalism and international business and so on, is the question of whether or not poor states can get rich with free trade. You guys already mentioned outsourcing sort of as one factor that's key to globalization. Well, I mean, do countries like India, do they have a shot? Can they make money? Can they do better? Can China get richer? Well, I mean, if you look at the evidence, I think one would say yes. And an example of this, or anyway, is something that they refer to in literature. BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, China. And what it refers to are the increasing size and power of these four countries that were really poor developing countries, but are really increasing in size and power to rival those of the major industrial powers of the last century.
It's possible, of course, for poor states to get rich with free trade, and pursuing a strategy of specialization is one way in which you can do it. And what's India specializing in this case?
Service.
Right.
Consumer service.
Service, right? And they can do it cheaper, maybe better, if not better now, maybe better down the line, maybe they'll learn.
The argument is by 2050, these combined economies could eclipse the combined economies of the current richest countries of the world. And these four countries combined currently account for more than a quarter of the world's land area, more than 40% of the world's population. Brazil surpassed the UK and France as the world's fifth largest economy, worth $42.2 trillion in 2010. China by 2020 is supposed to be the largest economy in the world. It already became economy number 2 in size in 2010. So any examples you can think of globalization?
Outsourcing.
Okay, outsourcing, right? And so where would that fit in? How culture?
They're forced to know a little bit more about our culture because they're doing business with us.
Yeah, that
Right,
video
okay.
we watched. That
Have to
video,
speak our language.
the video we watched showed them learn how to talk right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Accent neutralization, I like that.
Yeah,
That
was
was
funny.
like the slang and calling themselves Bobby Joe and Mary Jane, and they have an accent.
That's right, okay. So outsourcing certainly makes the world a more similar place anyway, culturally.
Asian markets, I don't know.
Asian markets, what about Asian markets?
I mean, fashion-wise, culture is between the United States and Asian countries is huge right now, right?
One thing you guys didn't say, and I'm not exactly sure even where to put it, is the advancement of technological change. You just think about like, Arab Spring revolutions and being fueled by Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that. I mean, just the mode of communication being so fast that just you could sell stuff fast, you could sell it, transport an idea immediately. All this stuff I think really facilitates an increased level of globalization as well.
One final advantage to globalization is that as states become richer, they have a greater drive toward democratization. They move from farms into the industry, into service, and you name it. But as they get wealthier over a period of time, it creates a middle class, and this middle class becomes more politically demanding of their government. It has a chance, they become more educated. They start wanting to read newspapers and pay attention to the internet, learn more and more stuff, and they want to make more money. And as they want to make more money and become freer, they put these demands on their government, which changes things. And a lot of what many people would argue you've seen in the Arab Spring revolutions is exactly this process happening, where there's a rising middle class, and we've got some dictators that really aren't capable of adapting to those changes, and so you end up with a potential conflict. But in the long run, one would argue that they not only get wealthier, but they become more democratic over a period of time. And certainly we can argue that that's true in many of these other developing countries in East Asia, where maybe there's not conflict and demand for democracy. I mean, India is already a democracy, but certainly they do move forward. Things do get better, and they become more stable. There's a wealth theory approach to this too, and just consider these numbers. They're a bit dated, but nonetheless the principle's interesting, right? Countries with per capita GDP above $6,000 are almost all stable democracies and do not revert to authoritarianism. Countries with per capita GDP below $5,000 have trouble establishing and sustaining democracy and often revert to authoritarianism. Isn't that interesting? It's like the richer you get, the more likely you are to end up with a stable government, with a democratic government. If you guys were on the strategic planning and advisory council to George Bush as far as like what you ought to do about Iraq or what you ought to do about Afghanistan, or even nowadays, what should you do about Cuba? What should you do about North Korea? You know, what should you do about Iran? The answer, according to a lot of free traders, is you trade with them. You send American businesses in there, and that's going to transform them like it transforms India. They're not going to want to bomb the crap out of us anymore, or think about it if they're even capable, right? They're going to be more worried about the shopping mall than they are about the infidels. Now this is great, of course, in terms of human rights and in terms of the kind of society that these people operate within, but it also has implications for security as well. As these countries become more democratic, so the argument goes, you end up with a greater level of peace between different countries because democracies are less likely to go to war with each other. Let's say we get in a tiff with Japan or something like that. You know, we could really stick it to the Japanese by bombing the Tokyo stock market, right?
It would just hurt us.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, that's yeah, exactly. I mean, that's part of the other side of globalization, is that, you know, does it make sense for us to go to war with China? I mean, what happens if we go to war with China? What happens to the prices of stuff at Walmart?
They're really high.
Right. I mean, you know, what happens to factories in China? They shut down. Okay, so, I mean, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot if we engage in major power conflict with countries where we are truly interdependent. Well, let's talk about free trade zones here for a little bit. What's a free trade zone? Okay, or at least you reduce the restrictions compared to other trade relationships, compared to other places in the world. First one is the EU, which we sort of mentioned earlier when we talked about globalization. The EU started as a free trade organization in 1952. You had 6 countries that decided they were going to freely trade coal and steel. Why coal and steel?
Train.
Ships? What kind of ships? What kind?
Military ships.
Oh, military. Right, absolutely. Okay? It's like they used this stuff to fuel their war machines for, you know, the previous 100, 200 years or something like that. For them to suddenly decide, oh, now we're just going to, like, just trade this stuff freely and reduce the protectionist barriers on that, that basically meant that, for all intents and purposes, the UK had access to French steel, or the French had access to British coal, or whatever. Eventually, the UK wasn't part of it at first. But, you know, these rivals, these people who were like fighting each other, are now basically trading in strategic materials, which is, you know, crazy from a security standpoint. But the idea is that if you could actually trade this stuff, then you become interdependent, and if you're interdependent, then you're not going to fight each other. If you increase those transactions, then, you know, maybe you can find some common economic interests, which basically is what happened in the long run. So today it's practically a super state with its own common currency. It's got a common political policy, laws that govern all the member states. It has conditions for joining, and it embraces all aspects of free trade, right? There's no tariffs, right? It's basically like, you know, trading between Kansas and Missouri, you know, no big deal there. They have free flow of labor, so if I want a job and I'm a British person, I can go over to France and just get a job. And a single currency. Like I said, citizens have EU passports that can cross national borders without guards. Truckers can move, you know, just like I said, between Kansas and Missouri without a checkpoint. And countries are absolutely desperate to join. Why?
Goods and services that you may not otherwise have.
Jobs, access to goods and services. Very good.
Double ally thing.
Right. And the EU is the largest economy in the world. I mean, it is larger than the U.S. It's larger than China. Right? Now, we don't count it that way. We count it by individual countries. But that's a huge organization of countries, basically, that share a common economic zone like that. It's a really big deal. Turkey's one of the countries that's desperate to join. And they have different levels of membership, right? So, you know, you could be like Poland or something like that and sort of be on your, want to be on the waiting list sort of end, without being necessarily a full member. And you can still have access to the labor market, for example. You know, there's massive numbers of Polish people, for example, who, through legal means, are filling up cheap labor jobs in the UK. And just like people in the United States get mad about the illegals coming over here from Mexico and supposedly taking the jobs that everybody wants so badly, right? The same thing is happening in the UK as well. And there's some challenges that are emerging from that too. But in the case of Turkey, right, I mean, you know, they're looking for all those advantages that you guys have already mentioned. And what are they willing to do? Well, there are conditions for joining. Basically, you have to engage in democratic reforms. You have to really become a democracy. You have to improve your human rights standards. You have to eliminate the death penalty. Like, they don't allow any countries that's got the death penalty. We're one of the few countries in the world left that still has the death penalty in the world. It's like us and China and Saudi Arabia and Iran. Like, we're on the, like, you know, nasty list as far as still having the death penalty. All these other countries basically just done away with it. You have to do that in order to join the EU. Turkey basically has reformed their prison system. They have improved the quality of their democracy, improved their human rights record, just because they want a piece of this, economically. Interesting, huh? All right, so the EU is one example. Another example I like to say is the United States. You know, we're a free zone. You know, we just think, hey, well, we're just a country, right? But that's not really the way it was set up originally. I mean, 1789, U.S. Constitution created the Commerce Clause. Before that, we were, you know, the Articles of Confederation. We were separate states that were loosely associated together and kind of not very strong binding government. You know, we used to have tariffs against, you know, between New York and Massachusetts, and, you know, states printing their own money and all sorts of stuff like that, right? It wasn't until the Constitution that did away with all that and created a single common market for all American states. And over the past 200 plus years, it's been an incredible success economically, right? I don't think anybody can argue about that. The interesting question, though, I think, is like, could or should the United States have a similar transformative effect as the EU by offering conditions of membership? Let's say we wanted to open it up. Say, I know this sounds ridiculous, but Afghanistan, Iraq, whoever, right? You want to become the 51st state? What must you do in order to make that happen? Maybe it'll take you 50 or 100 years, but can we transform other countries as a result of our economic influence just by people wanting a piece of what we've got?
Are the transactions that we're engaging in that we call globalization. That is, you know, tech companies or whatever those major multinationals, those countries coming in, is that creating a situation where people are really getting fed and getting better water? Or is it meaning that a few people are getting rich and buying us cheese? Right? And there are different answers to that question. You know, I'm not trying to say that it's good or bad. You know, if wearing my globalization, my free trade hat, I will say it's awesome. Okay, I will say that, you know, what's going to happen is that, you know, as those cities start growing, as those people have more money, it's just going to spread. And those people who at one point have poor quality drinking water, you know, tax revenues are going to increase from that government as a result of increased profits from businesses, and those tax revenues will allow them to invest in areas and try to, you know, increase and improve those additional areas, and things are just going to get better for them. Much of outsourcing does involve a level of training. It involves a level of acculturation and trying to deal with stuff, but a lot of times they'll say, look, that's a worthwhile investment, because if we can still pay them relatively less, and if they can learn to do that job, then they'll have the opportunity to take your jobs. Over time, they may increase their rates. You know, they become more valuable. You know, China ceases being the sweatshop of the world. Maybe it goes someplace else, but then they specialize in things that are more along the level that, you know, that they're good at. As their wealth increases, they become a consumer market. As we have an increasing middle class in China, in the Arab world, in India, now it becomes an opportunity not for us to take advantage of cheap labor, but for us to sell stuff to them. And then, you know, a lot of times you can argue that people at the bottom end are losing jobs, and, you know, what about looking out for number one? Well, as new markets open, one would argue that more business opportunities open up here as well for new jobs and things that actually we do well at, that we can actually make money doing. And so it's just sort of, I guess the answer would be, you know, it's a matter of time. was one of the people who got some hail damage on my roof, right? So, you go to the insurance company, you get a quote, get the roofers to come out and have a look at it. And of course, there's somebody next door to me, and they've got, roofers out there, a bunch of Mexicans working on the roof and stuff like that. I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, how many of those guys are illegals? You're thinking about all this stuff, right? And then I'm thinking, you know what? If I want to have my roof fixed, like replaced on the cheap, am I going to have a problem with paying, Mexicans nothing in order to get it done? Well, I don't think Mexicans do a bad job.
Well,
They just get paid less. And maybe I shouldn't care about whether Americans have jobs versus Mexicans. Okay, so they spend money, and what do they spend money on?
Yeah.
Could be American goods, could be Mexican goods, but does it matter? I mean, if we're raising their standard of living by sending them money, and there's more businesses that are established as a result of that fiscal stimulus in the private sector, maybe that means fewer Mexicans going across the border. Maybe that means that there's more jobs there, and they don't necessarily need to come to America. Maybe there's nothing wrong with sending money down there. I mean, that's kind of the whole thing with globalization, at least on the outsourcing side of things. It's like, if I want my dollar to go further, then why don't I want to take advantage of cheaper labor? Unless it's my job.
Relatives feel infected and they just
Yeah. I can argue any side, I don't care.